My name is Sean, and I work at UCSD in San Diego. So, um, a wise person once told me that there are two important questions for every person in their life. I see she's trending. One question is, who am I? The other question, why am I here? So maybe let that sink in a little bit. Who am I? Who am I? And it sounds a little bit silly, maybe. And why am I here? What is my purpose on this earth? Why have I been given this body? Why am I in this specific place and time in history? If we can answer these questions, life becomes a lot more, I think, clearer, more meaningful, more interesting. When we struggle, because we all go through phases in life where we don't know the answers, then things feel a little bit like we don't have a direction, a little bit unclear, a little bit difficult. We can become lost a little bit. So I hope that all of you, after today, feel like you're able to answer these questions a little bit better. Maybe at the end we can come back to them, but who are you? Well, you're someone who came to this event today. You gave up your time. You could have been in La Playa, you could have been at the beach, and you came here. So that might help answer a little bit, who am I and why am I here? And so we'll go through the slides and things, but maybe as we go through, keep that question in mind. I don't make any money outside of my job, so that's what this slide says. Everyone can do something. You all did something today, so I don't even need to tell you that. Oh, good question. So we had a great presentation on the clinical work, and now we're going to zoom out. And we're going to look at this topic from a much broader perspective, and then talk a little bit about what you can do, but we already had a great talk on that. So when I think about this group on the United States side, I think about two populations. One is a group of kids that either grew up or were born in the United States, but they have parents and families who are undocumented. The other group are kids who lived most of their life in a different place of the world, but then they went to the United States or they are seeking asylum. So two different groups. So I'm just going to kind of skip through this. This slide, you have to see it straight without it kind of looking weird. Shows all the different ways you can get into the United States. So the first way you can get into the United States is, let's say you're from Colombia and there's some armed conflict there, you have to flee. Then you can go to another country, neighboring country, and say, I want to apply to be a refugee in the United States. Very, very small amount of people get that opportunity. So that's A here. And if you are lucky enough, then when you get to the United States, they have a whole package for you. They have services, benefits, everything. The other option, option C, is for you to come to the border and request asylum. And unfortunately, even though you're following the rules, a lot of times that means you're placed in the detention center while you're awaiting your hearing. And this is where you saw the news about families being separated and things like that. And then you go to have a hearing with the immigration judge. Option D is what happens if, unfortunately, you are picked up by Border Patrol or some other legal entity in the United States, and you don't have papers, even then you can technically request humanitarian relief, but usually it's not going to be granted in those cases. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip through some of this, but I do want to show a little bit. The percentage of immigrants in the United States has increased over time. So the United States has become more multicultural, and that's why on our side of the border, we have to really care about this issue because you can see about 5% of kids in 1970 were immigrants, but about 13% in 2015, right? So almost tripling. And then first or second generation immigrants in terms of kids went from 17.5 to 25.4. So a quarter of the kids in the United States are first or second generation immigrant, 25%. That means no matter where you work, you will see immigrant children and adults. So this is important for us. 5 million children in the United States have at least one undocumented parent. A lot of kids have an undocumented parent. And up to 10%, almost 10% of kids born in the United States throughout a certain time span had at least one undocumented parent. So a lot of kids in the United States are living with at least one parent who's undocumented. So, and why does this matter to child psychiatrists? Because all child immigrant youth, regardless of where they're from, are at higher risk for discrimination. And we already heard this from our colleagues, but like educational, psychological, and social negative outcomes, and some friendship difficulties, cultural conflicts, money problems, and trouble at school, and sometimes conflict with their parents, and then community violence as well. So now we're going to talk about the group of kids who lived almost their whole life in a different country, but they had to flee because usually, well, we'll talk about why. And I like this slide because it helps me to remember all the people you interviewed today in the morning. Think about the number of things going through their mind. You know, what's going on with my children? What's going on with my family back home? Am I going to be able to cross the border? If not, where do I go? Just so much. And this really kind of shows just all the different and that the local people, do they support me? Do they discriminate against me? It's a lot, right? So everything you guys did today was awesome, was super, super helpful. For that moment, they probably felt very validated by your presence. Okay, so my friends already talked about this. We don't need to go into too much detail, but we do break the trauma down into 3 phases. Before they left the country of origin, what happened on the way, and then what happens after they arrive. Okay, so there's an incorrect assumption on the United States sometimes, depending on what type of media you consume, where people will suggest that the refugees who are coming from their countries are just doing so for a luxurious life. Not that they actually have real problems. So now I'm going to show you some data that actually will contradict that. So one study showed about 80% of kids fleeing Central America said violence was the main reason that they were fleeing. 80%, right? And then oops. So this slide starts to get at the number of people. I would go to 24 people per minute are displaced across the world. And it's actually much higher. These are old statistics. But you think about like just today, like, I mean, just per minute, 24, like it's thousands just since we've been doing this since the morning. But I don't want to be too negative. You know, you guys are doing something about it. Now, we look at worldwide, almost 120 million people displaced. If you think about what this means historically, during World War II, so that's like, with Germany and England and Russia, all these countries, it was about 40 some million at that time. And that involved like most or half of the continents of the world. So we're at really high numbers, historically high numbers worldwide. That's why you guys are seeing people in the shelters. And this graph just represents the fact that as conflict goes up in countries, the number of refugees goes up. So the red bars are conflict, violence, and the blue is refugees and asylum seekers. So it shows there's a direct correlation between armed conflict and violence and refugees. So this would contradict the idea that people are just coming for luxury. It's because of armed conflict. There are stateless people, like people from Palestine, for example, who have a hard time with asylum because where they live isn't even recognized as a country. So it's important for us to remember that too. But the areas in the world that are most impacted now, if you see the big jumps, are like Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and South Sudan in Africa. Those are the biggest, but it could be anywhere, right? And this is a graph that shows homicides across the world. And United States is about here. And you can see that there are a lot of places that are more dangerous to live right now than the United States. Even though the United States has plenty of improvements that we need to make. Okay. I would say because the Yampi folks did such a good job talking about child psychiatry, that when we do look at homicide, it is a problem of youth, young people, because you see 15 to 29 is the highest bar, and then 30 to 44, and then it goes down. And so I think the idea of starting young is right on there. I'm just going to skip through some of this. And so ultimately, we have more children who are being displaced. And then, okay, so I try to think about, because there's no way for me to really relate to somebody who's gone through this, because I've had a pretty good life, to be honest. So like I try to put myself in the position, and this is something I share if I come across somebody who has that idea that people are just coming for a life of luxury. I will ask them, have you ever lost sight of your child? It happened to me one time at a state fair, and our son was like 4, and I lost him for like 10 minutes, and I was freaking out. And then longest 10 minutes of my life. Then I found him, and I was just like, oh, all this relief. And then you're thinking, okay, if it was so hard for me to have a 10-minute separation, like what would it be like for me to say, I'm going to send you on a journey thousands of miles with somebody I don't know, with the hope that you'll get a better life? Like you would have to be in a pretty bad situation for that, right? And I think a lot of you guys today helped families who are going through that situation. And so this is Syria, and just Syria alone, like, because we're just listing these numbers. This is the city of Los Angeles. It never looks like this because there's usually more pollution, but so you would have to displace the whole city of Los Angeles 3 times just to get to where Syria is with displacement. So that gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. And there's one study that I found that said in certain countries you can have more gang members than police members. And I like this slide because I think it's easy to look at it in a black and white way, where you just see good guys and bad guys, what I'm wondering as the child psychiatrist is what happened to this person when they were young? What opportunities did we miss to help them take a different path, right? So we don't see good and bad guys. We see trauma, and trauma is trauma. Okay. And then another reason people flee, unfortunately, is sexual trauma. And this happens a lot in civil war areas. It can also just happen on a domestic violence sort of scale. And so I imagine a lot of, and it's not just the adults, it's the kids too. And so I imagine that a lot of the cases you saw this morning, some of the people, I mean, it came up in our session too, as well. One thing for us to remember is, and my colleagues already talked about this, is protecting gender and sexual minorities. And there are a lot of places in the world where you can receive the death penalty for being a gender or sexual minority, or be put in prison, or and even countries where there's no law against being a gender or sexual minority, there are still places where, like, for example, in this region, it's just not as friendly, or so it may be taboo, or who can get help from police and things like that. So, okay, because of everything we just talked about, we have seen an increase in the United States in people who are requesting asylum. So it kind of correlates with the increase in armed conflict, increase in displacement, and so more people are requesting asylum. And we'll kind of keep going here. Okay, true or false? We could ask a question. Who thinks the US border crossings are at an all-time high? If you think so, raise your hand. Yes. If you don't think so, raise your hand. No. Okay. And it's kind of a trick question because it depends on how you look at the data. And that's why we have to be careful with the news, because they'll say it's at an all-time high in the past 10 years, and they'll kind of throw that last thing in there. So this shows the border crossings going back to World War II, all the way to the 40s. Very, very old data. And you can see in the 40s, there was a big, we had like Nazi Germany, we had the Holocaust, like all kinds of stuff happening. And then as the global conflict kind of declined, we saw the numbers go down. And then you can see since the 70s, we've sort of had peaks, and then it would come down, and then peaks, and then it would come down. But if we look specifically at the last 20 years, we technically are at a high. But that's just if you're looking at the last 20 years. I think this is an interesting graph, especially that we're in Mexico right now. Beautiful country. And you can see in the 90s, most of the people coming to the United States were Mexican. And as you start to get towards 2022, a much bigger percent of people crossing the border were not Mexican. They're from other countries, and probably the same countries we've been talking about, where there's civil war and all kinds of other things. So that's an interesting thing also, like I think it's an assumption sometimes that we make, and it may be a false assumption. And I'm just going to keep going. I'm sure you've heard that there's an election in the United States, about to happen. But politics do matter in terms of people who cross. But I think both of these administrations have actually been pretty harsh at the border. And so that assumption actually may not be true. And which group do you think we're seeing more of now? A is a joke, like, don't take that seriously. Yeah. But criminals, single men coming over more, single women, or unaccompanied kids and minors? D, okay. You guys are very, very with it. So when you're looking at, unaccompanied kids and family units, you can see as you get, it just kind of explodes. We're almost none before, and then you get a lot more of those folks. So probably in the shelters, you're seeing family units, or you're seeing part of a family, not the whole family. And then I think this is saying basically the same thing. And okay, so then the question is, that was all just pre-migration trauma. So now the next question is, what happens during the migration? And you guys already know a lot about this, so I'm gonna probably try to go fast. You guys know about La Bestia, the train, how people get here. You know that people can be like, kidnapped and things on the way. I probably don't need to belabor that. And this is close to where I lived for 7 years. I lived in New Mexico and did some work in El Paso, Juarez at that time. And when people, I don't know what people think in the United States when they think of the border. I think they think it's this like big brick wall, like the Wizard of Oz, but you guys are too young to understand what I'm saying. And I think they think that like it's like, like maybe like Ritz-Carlton or Hilton and like, like a strip. This is what it looks like. And so it's pretty dangerous to cross because you can see it's going to be hot, there's no water, and it's easy to get lost, right? And, and that's why it'd be nice if people didn't feel forced to have to do it. But because of that, unfortunately, people do pass away when they feel desperate and they try to cross. So that's all that this data is showing is just people do pass away. And oftentimes it's the heat exposure and water, basically the two big things. So this is kind of a sad, but I think also inspiring image. It's sad because the red dots basically represent that if you look back about 20 years or 25 years, unfortunately, thousands and thousands of people have passed away trying to cross the border. So why is it inspiring? All the blue flags are stations that medical volunteers have put there to help people. So you have water, electrolytes, first aid kits, blankets, and these are all being placed in Arizona. There's No Mas Muertes is the organization that does this. And so they're trying to help. They're trying to help people. They even have been going out and setting up like little mobile clinics, but if they get caught, they actually get in trouble. So there's like a balance with it. Okay. And then, okay, so people have sexual trauma on the way. We don't have to belabor this depressing stuff. And my colleagues already talked about this. Let's go back. Okay, well, let's go here. I don't want to flood you. Okay, so the United States had this policy in the last administration to mandatory separate the family when they cross the border, right? And then it got all the news. And so unfortunately, there's still kids, even now, that haven't been reunified with their families. And then the separations do still happen. So we have been, the APA and AACAP, which is like AMPI on the United States side, have been writing papers, position statements, and the whole medical community is basically we need some like like some fun in this. But the whole medical institution is against separating families, and almost every major medical organization has come out against it. We're hoping that that helps to influence policy going forward. We wrote a research paper. Unfortunately, obvious things. If you don't have data, a politician won't believe you, even if it's so obvious. Like if you ask any politician, "Can I have your child?" They will say no, right? But if you talk to a politician who's not informed, they will say, "Oh, it's not really a big problem for families," right? So we got data that shows that the parents have more PTSD, depression, and anxiety when they're separated from their kids, and that the kids have all kinds of emotional and developmental problems, which Ampi already covered that really good. And so this is what the detention facilities kind of look like in the United States. You can imagine during COVID, it was a problem. It's like super crowded, and they're pretty run down. It's hard to get medical care in detention. And this is where I used to do most of my evaluations. And so we wrote another paper on detention. We looked at a lot of different papers and tried to get the data together. What happens if you're in detention? And so basically, there's a meta-analysis that shows any length of detention is harmful. And the longer you're detained, the worse it is. So they followed up with the migrants 10 months, 3 years, and even 4 years after detention. And the people who were in detention had higher rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety than the people who were not placed in detention and awaited their trial in the community. So, I mean, 4 years, that's a long time. So the impact is significant and it lasts for a long time. Okay. And this is just showing the rates of different conditions in detention, and the rates are really high. So the other thing, actually, I think the case that we had this morning made me think of this. Kelvin actually said, our wonderful child psychiatry fellow, he made the observation, child psychiatry is really about taking care of the parents and the family. And in this study, almost all of the parents who were interviewed before detention said, I'm pretty good at being a parent. But after they had been in detention for some time, said they did not feel like they could really adequately care for their child in that environment. I mean, even the shelter, it looks pretty hard today, but detention is far more restrictive than even the shelter was. Okay, and then unfortunately, sexual trauma does occur even in US detention, which is horrible. And as soon as these reports came out, we started writing position statements against them. And like, yeah, it was pretty bad. Okay, so as a result, we've had more and more cases. And so, but we don't have enough judges. So people are sitting in detention longer and longer because there's too many cases. And I'm not sure why we don't have enough judges to see them. And so a lot of them go undecided. And if they're undecided, then they may, what do we call it? It's unclear what will happen to the person. And so if a person comes to immigration court in the United States, they're not given an attorney. To sort of like compare it, if you commit a crime in the United States, you get an attorney. Like if you commit murder, right? You get an attorney. But if you haven't done anything and you just cross the border, you don't get an attorney. So you have these like silly cases of like little kids trying to represent themselves in court, which is a joke, but it can happen. Again, our advocacy is important. This is showing that the percentage of asylum claims denied has increased over time, but it does go up and down. But in the last few years, this is the most recent I could find the data that we're denying a lot of cases. Maybe they're coming back to Mexico. Maybe they're going back to the country of origin.
So then I come back and I can never find myself. Thank you.
Okay, last depressing slide, I promise. It's gonna come up, it's gonna come up, it's gonna come up. People do die by suicide in detention. So that's something we have to be aware of also. So when we make the case to legislators, we don't want for-profit detention anymore. One of the reasons is because it can be life-ending. And if you don't, these people may have their life, right? So that's another argument we make. Okay, I'm gonna go through this really fast, but not too fast for our interpreter. So I don't know if you ever wonder, those of you on the Mexican side, what happens to these kids once they cross? Not the ones who are in detention, but let's say the ones who have an undocumented parent. Maybe they were born in the United States. Maybe they were born here or somewhere else and went over when they were young, but they basically lived their whole life in the United States. And what's life like? I mean, this picture kind of gives you an idea of one kid working very hard picking strawberries, right? So, and one thing to keep in mind is that most of these kids should have all of the rights of a United States citizen, right? Because they were born in the United States. The ones who weren't born in the United States, they probably still should have some sort of rights by virtue of being on US soil. That gets a little bit more unclear. But I think maybe 80% of these kids living with an undocumented parent in the United States were actually born in the United States. And yet we see that those kids have higher poverty, their parents don't get good jobs, or they don't get good wages. Keep moving here. And it's hard to find good housing if you're like, a migrant worker or something like that. And so overcrowding, and then like hard to find washers and dryers, and overcrowding also spread more disease. And then also, unfortunately, these kids have worse educational outcomes. So like developmental issues, math and reading issues, and less likely to go to preschool, which we heard earlier about why 0 to 5 is important. And part of it is, if the parents are working 2, 3 jobs, very tough jobs, labor jobs in the fields, in the factories, how much time and money and energy are they going to have to think about preschool? I mean, they're like food, place to stay, are the big ones. And then kids who are born in the United States but have an undocumented parent also have worse healthcare access, even though they should have access to all the healthcare. But they use health insurance at lower rates, and sometimes their family doesn't know what they're eligible for. Sometimes the families are afraid that if they use a service, then they won't get a green card, or they'll get picked up and then they'll get deported. So they don't come in. But you all know what happens when you don't prevent disease. Then you come in all the way to the end, it's really bad. It's really severe, right? And then this basically, the rest of this talks about what happens to kids and families when their parents do get deported. And you probably don't need the next 20 slides to convey to you that it's not good. Bottom line, right? So we can probably just move through. I'll just kind of keep going, sorry. Okay, I like this picture. This is a workplace raid. So workplace raid, what I mean by that, if you're on the Mexico side, is let's say there's a chicken factory in a rural area, and somebody tells the government, this place is hiring people without papers. Then the government can just sort of run in and seize people and arrest them and say, why don't you have your papers? If you don't have your papers, you're getting deported. So this is a picture of people who were apprehended and they're being in deportation proceedings. But what you're not seeing in the picture is that each one of these people has a family, right? That could be standing next to them. And how different would the picture look if you could see their family? Here, they're all looking down, and okay, if the newspaper says, these criminals were caught or something, you can convince yourself they're bad because they're looking down as tough guys, serious. But how different would the picture be if you saw all the families that were impacted? And then would we think differently about separating the parent, right? Okay, so we'll keep moving here. We know this is bad. Okay. Usually I can zoom out, like get out and then go down 5 or 10 slides. So, okay. All right. Okay, here we go. Good time. Good time. You can do something about this. And you already have. And you probably will. So I don't even have to convince you. But in the United States, when a doctor becomes a physician, they have to take an oath called the Hippocratic Oath. And you basically have to promise to do certain things as a doctor. Most of us don't follow it after we become doctors. The first part says, if I want to care for a person, I have to think about their family and economic stability and social issues, basically. And that social issues are part of being a physician. The other thing it says is that I will care for all of my fellow human beings, all, not someone who has money, someone who has the right insurance, someone who, is the right nationality. So, to me, if somebody is in a detention center or is in the United States but doesn't have papers, I can't really refuse them treatment, right? And so it is our responsibility. And Karina and I were talking too earlier today about how these families can't advocate for themselves because there's a risk, if they speak out. So we kind of have to do that. So how can you get involved? Well, you guys are already really involved, more involved than just about anybody I know. But one thing we haven't covered in the last few days is doing asylum evaluations. And that's actually where I've spent most of my time in this space, is doing asylum evaluations. And I'll talk a little bit more about them, but you can do them through Physicians for Human Rights. We teach every year we teach a workshop at the annual meeting, or you can just get one-on-one mentorship. Another thing you can do is provide clinical care, and Ampi killed that today. They did a great job talking about all the clinical care that you can do. You guys should write a textbook. I mean, that was great. That was great. And advocacy too. So asylum evaluations, this figure I think is important. If somebody comes to the border and they request asylum, they say, I came from a country, there was war, there was a gang in my neighborhood, I was targeted. Maybe I was targeted because of my race or religion. Maybe I was targeted because I'm transgender. Maybe I was targeted for any specific reason. I need protection. And if because they don't have the lawyer, only 10% of those cases get accepted. And then when I showed you that graph that showed all those cases that are being denied, that kind of lines up with this, 10%. If you have an attorney, you go up to 30%. But if you have an attorney and an asylum evaluation, you go up to 90% chance of having your case won. So the asylum evaluations are gigantically, hugely helpful, because without the asylum evaluation, the judge can just say, I don't believe you. But with the asylum evaluation, you have an expert, and we're supposedly objective, which of course none of us are. We all want to help everybody, but we're supposedly objective, and our report shows that objectivity, and it shows that, like, this person's gone through a lot, and it's because of the trauma, and they would do better in the United States. Okay. So maybe some more information about what is an asylum evaluation. Any provider can do this. So you can be a doctor, you could be a psychologist, you could be a therapist, you could be a nurse practitioner, you could be a nurse. I mean, really anyone in the healthcare space can do them. And what is it? It's just like sort of like the evaluation you did today with maybe a few things added to it. You can either do them in the detention centers or in the community. You can even do them via telehealth into Mexico. And I guess you could say why to do them, because it increases their chances up to 90%. So these are just some trainings that we've done and to get more people doing the asylum evaluations on the United States side. So far, we've trained about 1,500. So we're hoping to keep going with that on the US side, different places. Okay, I think I'm gonna skip past this part. And okay. Okay, maybe I'll go back. Sometimes people wonder, should I ask about someone's immigration status? Like, should I ask them, are you documented, are you not documented? Should I not ask them? So the kind of general consensus is a lot of people don't ask, but if you do ask, you probably don't want to document it because your records can get subpoenaed and then go to court. So that's probably the most important thing. If you ever do ask someone about their documentation status, it's probably helpful for you to explain why you're asking. Like, we've got this great program for people who are immigrants and you can get asylum or something. This is why I'm asking. But naturally people will be suspicious, right? And may not trust you if you're too forceful. Another thing you can do if you don't want to do the asylum evaluations is you can write a letter on behalf of your client to the court, and those are also very impactful. And it can be 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs. For example, I had a kid whose parent was getting deported. I just wrote a letter saying, I've been seeing them for the past year, and I see that this kid's mental health has deteriorated because their father is in deportation proceedings. And the attorney was very happy to receive that so she could use it in court. So simple letter can go a long way. Okay. One thing we talked about this morning is when we're doing this work with all these families, you guys all are already masters in trauma informed. I don't need to talk about that. And you're masters at being culturally sensitive. I don't need to talk about that. But I really want to like hammer home intergenerational. When these events happen, they happen to everybody in the family. And sometimes we think, oh, the kid is the one who's referred to us, or the mom is the one referred to us, or the grandparent is the one referred to us. But if we really want to maximize our impact, we have to treat everyone in the family. And then as a family, they can support each other in getting better and in their own wellness and in their own healing until they're all, but if we just do them one by one, we deprive them of the opportunity to heal as a group and support each other while they're healing. It's like a multiplier. Okay, we'll keep going through this. Okay, so we just talked about how it can be hard for these people to advocate for themselves because they can get deported. There's a real consequence. So what else can we do? We can use our professional organizations, OMPI, ACAP, SDACAP, to write policy statements, to make them official, and to send them to our legislators. We can write articles for our local newspapers. Those are probably the most impactful because that's what our patients read. Or for medical journals, nobody really reads those. Sorry. And we can do news interviews on the TV. And all of these are ways that you channel the people you met this morning, and their voice becomes your voice. So you are gone, and then they're like inside of you, and then that's how we get the courage. So these are just some articles that we wrote and TV stuff that we did. And I don't know if you guys know Veronica Escobar. She's a congresswoman in El Paso, and she's like very, very much for migrant rights. So finding those allies that we have in Congress, asking them how we can support them to stay in Congress, and then giving them information. So when she wants to introduce a bill on the Senate floor, she needs the data that we've just been talking about for the last hour to say this is the evidence for why we need to do this or that. Okay, so we're going to end with some pictures that are meant to make you feel good because this is pretty depressing, but you guys did a great job today. So this is something we never see almost in the United States. It's a European police officer being nice with a migrant child. And this was in Greece when all those migrants were trying to cross the ocean. A lot of them were drowning. People from Greece were running out into the ocean to get people and bring them to safety. So you can see all this stuff of the Greece and people who were helping out. And I mean, reuniting the families, keeping them together. This is our job, making life easier. This is all the stuff you guys were doing today. Okay, so being human is a given, keeping our humanity is a choice. And we go back to this question that this is a Syrian girl who made it to Germany and she made it, she's healthy, she's thriving. So the kids we saw this morning where we're like, oh, and you guys did a great job of saying we really can't say it's going to get better because it might not. But for the people who do get through it, it does get better, right? Okay, so I do want though, so hopefully all of you can answer the question now better a little bit. Who am I and why am I here? Maybe not the whole question, but at least a part of that question. I'm someone who cares about underserved communities, and my job here, at least to some extent, is to help with that. I also have to take care of myself because there's 170 million people who need help, and you won't get to all of them, but you can get to, if you take care of yourself, you'll be able to do this for a while. If you don't take care of yourself, you'll be able to do it for a little bit, and then you'll get burned out. Second thing, Mojde, will you come up? Okay, so we got this grant through AACAP to do this work. And after we got the grant, I did absolutely nothing. And Mojde has been day and night, emails, WhatsApp messages, spreadsheets. And Mojde actually has another job. Like, I know it's hard to believe, but like, she actually has a job. Like, and so when I think of who am I and why am I here, it's like, who am I? Let's put Mojde up there. And then it's like, if I'm like anywhere in the like universe of her, it's like it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So we let's do a standing round of applause. Yes, sir. And then all of our volunteers, the RHA staff, Karina, Ampi, all of our volunteers, our leads, our translators, everybody else, they were part of it. So that's all I've got.